That's where I think we have to be very careful, though, with proof texting, because if you start with the idea of love your enemy, and then you think you know what loving your enemy means,
Yeah.
you started speaking in the text rather than the text speaking to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I also feel like typically when we want to talk about loving our enemies or loving our neighbors, we're often not talking about what we're doing. We're trying to tell somebody else that they're not doing it.
Right.
That's how proof texting becomes weaponized. Then
100%.
right? And that is something that we want to be careful about. Because here's the truth, and this is where you have to start thinking about when you're going to apply hermeneutics.
Right.
You have to think about the context, right? Like when Jesus said those things, he wasn't speaking to that guy you know.
Right.
Now, he was speaking for that guy you know.
Yeah.
Right? So the Bible is written for you, but it's not written to you.
Right.
Right? It's not like all of these letters you have with these epistles were written to specific churches.
100%.
And we learn from their examples, right? And then you have these guys who wrote these gospels, and that teaching is for everybody, right? But it was written, first century
For sure.
Jewish tradition, right?
For sure.
Except for maybe Luke,
Right. Right.
right? There's just kind of this piece. It's interesting. I heard somebody say, like in those times, like one of the complaints about the Gospels is there's not enough about Jesus' childhood.
Yeah.
Well, that's because a modern biography would talk about your childhood.
Right.
An ancient biography, it would be too expensive to waste time talking about their formative years.
Yeah.
If it's not seen as
And
relevant.
who cares? Yeah.
Right.
They're like, he's here. We don't need to explain how he got here. He's here.
Let's get to the point, right?
Yeah.
So the Bible was not written to you.
Right.
It was written for you. So you have to take that into context.
Yes.
You have to understand who was the original audience.
Yep.
What was happening, what was going on, right? So when we break down Elisha and the bears, we talked about the context of Bethel where they were at.
Right.
And how it was a hotbed for idolatry. It was a place where they had turned from God. The king had set up these idols and said, you know what? It's too much for you guys to go worship where you're supposed to worship.
Right.
So here's a golden calf.
And just worship him.
Worship that. That's the guy who got you out of Egypt.
Right.
Such a weird thing. The guy certainly knows the story of Aaron. Right. Like, why would you do that?
Right.
So that's the context.
Right.
That's what is happening, where it's happening, who it's happening to. Right. And then you also have the kind of the chapter context. Right. So you have the context of the story of the who, what, when, and where, but you also have to take the context of the other words that are being spoken.
Right.
So like every time we take something from Jesus, okay, we love to pull the Beatitudes.
Right.
But what's the full sermon?
Right. 100%. Yeah.
And what does he say after? Judge not lest you be judged. For the measure in which you judge is the measure by which you will be judged.
Right.
So therefore, take the log out of your eye before you point to the speck in your brother's eye. Right. So there's more to that conversation than just don't judge.
Right. Well, and it's meant to be read all together.
Right.
And I think that's where the disservice can happen a lot of times is you're reading a letter to Romans who they read in their entirety.
Right.
We're reading a passage at a time because we don't have the time to really unpack every single.
Well, we don't want to give the time.
Right. Sure. Well, that's probably the better bet. Yeah. I know I got about a 30-minute clock. And at the end of that 30 minutes, I could just wrap up. And even if I'm not done, if I'm at 30 minutes, most people are like, all right, church needs to start wrapping up, And so, but I, it's funny you say that because I think the weaponization of proof texting, I see this a lot, just even as a pastor when I'm preaching, not necessarily even at our church, but when I preach about, you'll get those people who are like, yeah, when you're saying stuff that like, they're like, yeah. And you're like, you shouldn't be really agreeing with this as much as you are.
Yeah.
Because this, you've got someone else in your mind. And I will say, and I always say this, I have never once written any sermon for any person. There's never been but what I will do is I will tailor not interpretation, that's the wrong word. I will tailor presentation of sermons knowing people's context. So by that I mean like if I know I have a same-sex attracted person, I am going to read Romans 1 and 2 because we were talking about that. but how I talk to them is important in being received. You know, and I think that that's something we have to understand, because the Jesus says people are going to hate you for the text alone.
Yeah.
You know, they're going to hate you for what I have to say already.
Yeah.
So don't make your job harder.
Right.
Don't proof text, because that's what proof texting does. It makes your job harder.
Yeah.
Because you read Romans 1 and you're like, see, you're a sinner, you're going to hell. And then you read Romans 2, and Romans 2 is like, oh, hey, by the way, you religious folks, you're no better. And then you're like, oh, snap. You see, and so you get this idea. And I think that that's where a lot of people, as Christians, we struggle with proof texting and the weaponization, because we didn't contextualize. And we didn't contextualize our audience either. And so we miss all of these things that then become – I love when non-Christians use the Bible as a weapon, because I'm like –
you don't know how to fire that thing.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I mean.
You're pointing it the wrong way.
I was just going to say, there's this really funny, a spoiler alert, there's this really funny moment in The Skeleton Crew, which is a Star Wars thing, and I've talked to you about this before. Yeah. There's this really funny moment where this one of the characters is a young kid, and he idolizes the Jedi, and like he wants to be one. And there's this point where he finds a lightsaber, and he's about to defeat the bad guy or confront the bad guy, and he turns it he turns it on, but it's upside down, because he doesn't know how to handle it. He's never handled life. And that's how I see people when they proof text. It's like you've got a double-edged sword that could cut through anything. Yeah. But you're holding it by the blade, not by the not by the handle. And like as soon as you swing that thing, it's going to cut you and everybody around you. You know, and I think that's where we have to be, and this is where hermeneutics comes in, but this is where we as Christians have to be responsible. We have to – it's not that we can't say what the text says. So like Romans 1 does say things that are hard to hear. Yeah. We don't need to take that out, but we do need to hear how it's being said in order we can say it right.
Absolutely.
You know, and so I think that's where, like you said, context, who's saying it, who's he writing it to, or they writing it to. So important.
It does help with those rebuttals too. It was interesting. You talked about Romans 1 and Romans 2. It was like, well, Romans 1, you can use that and say, well, see, your boat is sinking. And here, it's like, yeah, but in Romans 2, my boat is sinking as well.
Right.
And it got me thinking about this idea of people on the Titanic. Mm-hmm. And like, imagine if the boat is sinking, the Titanic's going down, and one person walks up to the other and is like, you need to get on a safety raft because the boat is sinking. Mm-hmm. And their response is to say, your boat's sinking too.
Right. Exactly.
You're on the same boat.
Right.
Like we have to be able to express these things and work together on these things to get off the boat together.
That's why so we read it on 2 Timothy 3. All scripture is inspired by God and beneficial for teaching, for rebuke, for correction, for training in righteousness. That's why we have the Bible. Not to fire it like a gun, but it's great. It's a scalpel. It's great at cutting things out that, cancer, and doing the work of healing, And so when we proof text, it's a throwing knife. You know what I mean? Like, and you're just hoping something hits.